So we're going to bring in our next guest, Allison Fisher, the outreach director at Public Citizen. Allison, good evening. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, thank you for having me.
I'm glad to have you here. So you're here to talk about climate change coverage and how the media as a whole is not covering it enough. Can you break that down for me?
Yeah, it's not even about whether they're covering it enough. In this case, clearly they're not. But in this case, we're actually looking at when they do cover it, how well are they covering it? And are they conveying a sense of urgency in this issue? And what we found is overwhelmingly they're not. Our report looks at data for all of 2018, so all of the segments in which they're talking about climate change, we're looking at whether or not they're calling it a crisis or referring to it as an emergency. And what we found was less than 4% of those segments are calling it a crisis and using the kind of language that really signals to the American people that we're in trouble and the time to act is now. And just to give a little bit of context about 2018, and I don't have to give a lot of detail about this, but we know that we had another year of unprecedented wildfires, storms, heat waves, and just another round of overwhelming costs and death tolls because of climate-fueled weather. This is apocalyptic stuff, and the media is just not couching it in those terms or sending a signal that that we're in crisis, and we are.
I'm curious as if taking this a step further, you feel as if sometimes the coverage minimizes or mocks the issue, because now we've broken down how the coverage is not as serious as it should be, but I wonder if going all the way to the other end, if you think it's being mocked or minimized.
Well, certainly in some markets it is. What we found in the report, we looked at across the board, we looked at all of the major network news programs, ABC, CBS, CNN, MSNBC, and Fox. And spoiler alert, right? So Fox was undoubtedly, to use your word, mocking anybody that referred to the current situation of us overheating our planet, calling it a crisis. They mocked and belittled that term and that idea, and people that are putting that out there and saying this is the way that we need to define the terms of this issue now.
And oftentimes when the coverage looks like just as you've described, and it's someone who's come on as an expert to debunk climate change, they're never scientists. Why do you think that is so widely accepted? People who don't study the issue telling you that it doesn't exist and being able to go on, major platforms to do so.
Yeah, so it's interesting having. I don't watch Fox News, but I've been exposed to a lot of what they're saying because I've read hundreds and hundreds of transcripts around this issue. And it's interesting the way that they bring on some of these characters. They seem to have a pretty shallow roster of folks that they bring on regularly to basically talk nonsense and gibberish about this issue. It's more than anything, it's demeaning, and unfortunately, they have such a huge audience that they're exposing this to. The way that they describe kind of the credentials of the people that they're bringing on, I think are a little bit overblown and maybe suggesting that they're experts when maybe they're not. They certainly are contrarians, and they're probably well paid to say the things that they do.
Is there a network doing the best job and maybe, shocker, one doing the worst? I bet I could guess at least one of these.
Well, I think we covered the worst.
Right.
It's hard to say. In the report itself, and again, not looking at overall coverage, but kind of who's using this term, I think that we were finding CNN was kind of the cream of the crop there in terms of overall segments. MSNBC, Chris Hayes is doing a fantastic job on this issue. It's unfortunately, it's really hard to say because when you're talking about percentage points that are below 10, it's really hard to say anybody's doing the best. What you can say is that there's a ton of room for improvement. And that's a big part of why we did this report, to expose this issue, and then also to use it to undergird like a larger effort to pressure these networks to start calling it what it is and start then covering it like it is as well.
Okay, so let's break down another aspect of coverage that it's just fascinating to me, because now we've touched on how the media coverage is not doing what it's supposed to do and call it a crisis, call it an emergency. I also am fascinated by, and horrified at the same time, by the fact that it's kind of a forgotten aspect of this conversation, how climate change specifically affects communities of color and people of color, especially in cities and all across the country. And I wonder if that's something you all have looked at, and your thoughts on that.
Certainly. So a couple of things that I can say about that. Okay. Again, having read through all these transcripts, is they're not bringing on guests that can talk to that issue. They just, they're not bringing on the right people. They're not talking to the impacted people. If you talk to the impacted people in the frontline communities and the ones that are experiencing now, you're going to get a sense of urgency, that they're in crisis, that a response needs to come, and quick. But those are not, by and large, the people that they're talking to. So that's highly problematic. Another issue, just kind of in general, about the media in this issue, is they're not finding ways to make the climate crisis resonate and with the public and make it matter to the people that they're talking to. And part of the reason why they're not is because they're not telling those stories that you just alluded to. Let's see how it's affecting us. Let's stop talking about numbers and stop debating the science and stop talking about political horse racing, and let's talk about what's happening on the ground and who's suffering.
What do you think how can this be fixed? How can these networks do a better job? What needs to change? And do you think it's likely to change?
The short answer to what they can do in the immediate term is to start using this language that we're suggesting. What this report wanted to do, and we're not the first ones to say that climate change as a term is insufficient in describing what we're doing to the planet. There are many people in this space that have long since abandoned that term and are embracing communications and language in terms that really, again, convey the urgency. So, we want these networks to start using these terms: crisis, breakdown, emergency, chaos, and send the signal that they need to the American people that this is where we're at, and that we need a response immediately. Are they going to do it? It's the second part of your question. Well, I think there's a couple of things at play here. One, this increased pressure that an effort that we're part of by outside groups and just Americans in general, on these networks to do their job and to remember their core principles in this democracy, to inform and to engage and rouse the people to action, I think is putting pressure on them, and I'm hope working. I think the other thing is that there seems to be a growing awareness in the journalist community itself. I just attended a week ago in New York City, a conference hosted by The Nation and the Columbia Journalism Review at Columbia University. And the conference was called Covering Climate Now. What is this new playbook for a world that is 1.5 degree warming? And so, they're bringing together their community and they're saying, how can we make a difference? So there's pressure from out, there's pressure from within. And then unfortunately, I think, they're inevitably going to have to cover this. There's going to be more storms. There's going to be more extreme weather events. and more often. And so whether or not they like it or whether or not we all like it, it's going to have to be on the front pages sooner rather than later if we don't act.
Allison Fisher with Public Citizen, thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Thank you.
2 easy ways to follow the Young Turks. One is hit the subscribe button down below, then you're a TYT subscriber. And second is ring the bell. And when you do that on YouTube, you're notified of our videos.